Hi, this is my book, Grand Mal, A Life with Late Onset Epilepsy, and I'm Robert Dodge. The part I'm going to read comes from the very beginning, and you need a little backstory first. I got epilepsy after getting a mosquito bite, which gave me encephalitis, and I was 32 at the time. And what I'm going to read comes from the very first time I actually found that out, which my wife will be Jane in this reading. We'd gone, as we did in the summers, we'd taken a trip, and we'd gone to go camping in Morocco. So that's where I'm starting. We flew on to Morocco and camping began. After traveling to Casablanca and Marrakesh, we set up our tents at a campground outside of Fez and spent several days exploring the fascinating medieval Medina, a treat for me as a history teacher. Its narrow streets, often only a meter wide, prevented motorized traffic and were a maze of souks stocked with spices, dates, carpets, and various traditional items. Traversing them was perhaps as close as one could come to walking back in time. The most memorable sight was the leather souk, the world's oldest leather tannery. The odor was foul, but the colors and process spectacular. In a honeycomb of stone vessels in sections with many rich-colored dyeing pools, barefoot workers walking on the narrow rims of the vats and using poles to produce fabulous leather products. While we were seeing the sights of Fez, it was extremely hot, upper 90s, and when we returned to our campground of international travelers, Jane changed into a two-piece bathing suit, while I went barefoot and put on my swimming suit and a t-shirt. We were preparing to take down our tents and move on. Jane was outside, and I entered the tent to pack my things. Jane next heard a shout that she thought sounded non-human. Her immediate thought was that perhaps I'd been shot, but when she entered the tent, she saw me lying on the ground, convulsing violently. She grabbed a leather belt of mine and tried to force it in my mouth. That wasn't possible with my jaw clenched, and she screamed for help. Soon others were in the tent, among them our tour guide, and the camp director was contacted. I stopped convulsing but was incoherent and totally unaware when a flatbed truck arrived and the gathered campers placed me on a stretcher to load me on the back. Jane grabbed clothes, since we were in a Muslim country, and with our guide, rode in the cab of the truck to a public hospital. It was a walled facility with security at its entrance. Once we were allowed in, what was found guarded from the public was a wide circular driveway surrounding a large rectangular structure. At the hospital entrance, Jane and others got me off the truck and onto a gurney. She and our guide wheeled me down a hall in search of a doctor. The corridor we followed was dirty and crowded with people attached to IVs sitting on the floor. The open squat toilets were visible and filthy as roaches scurried about in the unsanitary conditions. I was in and out of consciousness by this time and recall soon lying on one of perhaps 20 metal frame cots with thin mattresses in a sparsely furnished ward with a concrete floor. This was where the doctors, who all spoke French, saw several patients at once. Jane's French was elementary, while our novice guide's French was only slightly more advanced, so communication was a challenge. Jane's tried mimicking a seizure to convey what had occurred, and she didn't want me to watch because she was afraid it would trigger another episode. She also didn't want me to know what had happened. I had partially dislocated my shoulder during my convulsions, and the doctor made no mention of the seizure, but she was going to send me down to have someone yank my arm to reposition my shoulder. At that point, Jane did what would become her habit. She took charge. She is this rather small, trim, dainty person and has always appeared considerably younger than she is. But when my health has become an issue and care was questionable or slow, watch out. She becomes extremely assertive and time after time got me through difficulties I couldn't possibly handle, or in many cases was not aware that they had existed. She had lost all confidence, in this public facility, and rather than push the gurney down to the area for shoulder realignment, she and the guide headed to the point where we had entered the building and exited. They managed to get me off the gurney, and by this time I could lean against a pillar and remain upright, but no more. It was at least 100 yards to the entrance of the compound where the cars were being let in, and the pavement was exceptionally hot. Jane tried chasing a few cars that were admitted to get them to stop, but had no luck. After a time, she and the guide decided they were going to get me outside the compound to the main streets, where it might be possible to hail a taxi. The guide gave me her flip-flops so I wouldn't burn my feet as she sacrificed her own. With one arm over Jane and the other over the guide, I was dragged across the hot surface and we made our departure. Outside the hospital compound, we secured a ride to our compound. Upon reaching the campground, I was set in the shade of a tree as it was still extremely hot. With no doctor or medical care, Jane had no idea of what to do next, and I was of no use. It is indicative of her state of mind that one idea she came up with was to buy an airplane to fly to London where we would be safe. She still hadn't told me anything other than I had passed out and hurt my shoulder. Goes on from there.